All right, we are live on Instagram and Facebook for Coffee and Questions. I'm testing another new method for Facebook today. So you'll see a bit of a, I guess, I don't know, logo on the screen of what's going on, but hopefully the image quality is much clearer this time. And yeah, just see how it goes. Progress over perfection, right? All right, good morning, everyone that's joining me on Insta. I'm having my second coffee today for Coffee and Questions, which is probably a bad idea for me. And you'll find out why soon, because today I am going to talk about caffeine. I had a really good question come through about caffeine and whether it's good for endurance performance. So I'm going to answer that today. So feel free to jump in if you're on here live on Insta or Facebook and ask me some questions about caffeine in particular. Or anything else, but I guess we'll try and stick with the caffeine train of thought to start with, and any other further questions I'll jump in and answer at the end. So I'll try and answer the caffeine one up first. Before I get started though, just a little bit of announcement. If you are a triathlete and you're looking for some help with your nutrition, then please join the waitlist for my Triathlon Nutrition Academy. It is starting in September. There is a firm date and nothing's going to stop me this time. A global pandemic stopped me in 2020, but there's definitely nothing that's going to stop me now. So there's a firm date in September that it's starting. If you need help with your nutrition and you're a triathlete, this is definitely the place for you. It's a really good community. I'm going to teach you all of the best nutrition information that there is out there. So to jump on the wait list, go to the website, dietitianapproved.com.au/Triathlon Nutrition Academy, but you should also see it on the front page, and just click on the button to join the wait list. And there you'll hear about like how to get started, when it's happening, and there's a bunch of freebies that you get along the way as well. So if you are interested, definitely do that. Good morning, everyone on Insta. We've got Kaz Stray, Queen of Cakes, My Plate of Happiness, Amanda Gillies, good morning, and a bunch of other peoples that I just missed in the beginning. All right, and if you're on Facebook, please drop me a comment and let me know that you're here as well. All right, let me get my things sorted. Got too many screens open. Story of my life. Get rid of that. Move this across, and let me see if I can see the Facebook comments while we're starting. Hold on one second. Hang on one second. Where'd you go, Facebook? I've lost you. Here we go. All right, there you are. Facebook's over here, and Instagram's over here. Good times. All right. All right, so let's get into it. So I had a really good question about, if you're just joining me, caffeine and sports performance. And I've lost stream. Hold on one second. Here we are. All right, now I can see you. Now I can see everyone. Progress, not perfection, right? Good morning, Liv. All right, I can see Facebook. I can see Instagram. If comments come through, I should be able to see them all. Okay, cool. All right, so let's get stuck into it. Good morning, Shauna. Shauna Goodgold, I miss you. Okay, so is caffeine good for endurance sports performance? Good morning, Gabby. I miss you too. All these people online, so exciting. Let me enjoy my caffeine while we talk about caffeine. How good is coffee? I agree, Liv. So is caffeine good for endurance sports performance? Absolutely. So today I'm going to answer that question for you, but I'm also going to go into a little bit more detail around caffeine. So like where you can find it, a bit of the evidence around it as a supplement and the effects. And then also talk through sort of how much and like when to take it. Good morning, Emma Reimer. Turns out everyone uses Instagram rather than Facebook. So I think going live on Insta is a much better option. Side note. All right, so obviously caffeine is a stimulant. I'm sure most people kind of recognize and understand that. And it's kind of a socially acceptable stimulant, right? It's widely used. It's just part of culture, which is interesting. Whereas say like, I guess alcohol is also a drug and that's kind of socially acceptable too. But then there's other drugs that aren't socially acceptable. So just a little food for thought, I guess. But where do you find caffeine? So most people kind of have an understanding of where you can get it. So tea and coffee are two of the main ones, but you can also get caffeine in chocolate. And then there's a whole range of sports nutrition products that contain caffeine as well. So gels and sun bars, sports drinks, like blocks and chews, those sorts of sports lollies. They're the main ones off the top of my head, but yeah, I guess a lot of sports products have them in them now. And then you've got things like Coke and Red Bull and energy drinks. There's caffeine like supplements like No Dose, which is a tablet. Emmy, you can't request to be in my live video. And good morning, Feed Your Future. Yeah, so No Dose is a caffeine sort of tablet. You'll often see it in like service stations because it's kind of associated with truckies using it to stay awake. And then there's things like Revy strips as well. They're a little caffeine like wafer that sits on your tongue. Not many people know about those, but they're like a mint sort of, well, there's a couple of flavors, but there's a mint one that, yeah, it's just a thin little wafer, sits in your mouth, dissolves, and there's a 40 milligram wafer, and then there's an extra strength 100 milligram wafer as well. So I guess the caffeine content of things varies widely as well, and having an understanding of that will help you with your overall plan. So like as an example, coffee, the amount of caffeine in a cup of coffee varies from like 60 milligrams up to 500. So it really depends on how it's made, whether it's instant or if it's brewed or percolated or if it's an espresso. And with the espressos, it depends on the beans and how it's extracted and then how long it's drawn for in the machine, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of variety of factors that affect the caffeine content of a coffee. So don't just think that you're taking a supplement or like a caffeine dose that's set. It's highly, highly varied. So we have a coffee machine at home, and every time you make a cup of coffee, the caffeine content would be different. Then a cup of tea also ranges how much caffeine is in it as well. So sort of 9 milligrams up to 50. And again, depending on how long you stoop the bag in there for, and the tea leaves, and you know the surface area and the temperature of the water and all those sorts of factors affect the caffeine content that extracts from the tea leaves. So again, like just being mindful of that it is a huge range for those two things because there's so many factors that affect the amount of caffeine that's drawn from the product. And then there's more set caffeine doses in products. So as an example, gels, they will tell you exactly how much caffeine is on the packet, but they range in terms of how much caffeine goes in there. So like an Endura gel has 8 milligrams of caffeine, which is probably one of the lowest on the market. Like there's not a lot of point of 8 milligrams of caffeine, I would say. But then there's other like Goo do an espresso love that's 100 milligrams, and there's other that are quite high as well. And then there's custom sports drinks that are companies, and you can dose your caffeine amount in there depending on how much you want or how much you need. So I'd be careful with putting caffeine in a sports drink because to get more fuel, you're therefore getting more caffeine, and we'll talk about that at the end as well. So they are where you get caffeine. I'm sure there's other products as well that I haven't mentioned, like I'm just thinking off the top of my head, like pre-workouts. Those sorts of products have caffeine in them as well, and they can be really, really high dosing. And there's a whole range of other stuff, you know, that has caffeine in it these days. Like I've seen muesli bars that have caffeine in them. All right, so while I get my caffeine dose, so there is a solid body of evidence that caffeine is beneficial. In the AIS supplement framework, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago, it is a group A supplement, excuse me. So it is one, good morning, Jacqueline Murphy. It is one that is like well-researched, and there's been like research since the 70s really. And then there's a solid body of evidence around how much to take and when, and we kind of know more about that. And that's evolved over the last 15 years too. So people have been using caffeine for ages. Like athletes, Ironman athletes in the 80s, you know, sort of 20 years ago, were using Coke before we even really understood the benefits of caffeine. So there is a really good body of evidence around caffeine's use, and in terms of endurance performance, like I guess I'm an endurance sports dietitian, there's definitely some solid body of evidence that caffeine is useful in that sort of space too, for any endurance activity that's longer than 60 minutes. But if you're an Ironman athlete, 60 minutes is an easy session for you. So we're talking the long stuff as well. It was actually removed from the WADA doping list back in 2004. So before that, athletes couldn't use it in and around competition. And that's pretty interesting, I think. So since 2004, we've kind of done way more research to understand its use and its applications, and have really good evidence-based protocols around how to use it now as well. Liv said, fancy seeing you here, Jacqueline Murphy. I love that you two know each other and are talking to each other on my live. All right, so the effects of caffeine. So caffeine has so many effects on the body, and I think also that we don't really fully understand all of it. A lot of the effects are central nervous system based. Good morning, Tab Draper. So I guess in terms of endurance performance, the effects of enhanced performance come from the central nervous system effects as well, but it does have different effects on the metabolism of fat, like from adipose tissue and at the muscle cell level. So it also changes muscle contractility. I do that movement with muscle contraction because of the synapse that we learnt in uni. I've been doing that for like 20 years, so I can't stop doing that anymore. The physiologist on live will find that funny. The rest of you will be like, what is this chick talking about? But in the main benefit for endurance sports nutrition, I would say that one of the biggest effects, and why I generally like to use caffeine in race plans, is that it lowers your perceived rate of exertion. So for the work that you're doing, it doesn't feel as hard. So for something like an Ironman, if somebody's happy to, I would generally write caffeine into an Ironman race nutrition plan, because it does like make you feel less fatigued. And there's always Coke available on the run course, but I find it quite useful to add caffeine into a bike leg and before as well. And we'll talk a bit about that later. So that would be the main sort of effect or benefit I would say for endurance sports nutrition, is that it lowers your perceived rate of exertion. So for the same like amount of work, you don't feel like you're working as hard. Another one of the effects of caffeine is that it actually has effects on the heart muscle and stimulation of adrenaline, so our fight or flight response. So if you're a responder or a non-responder, I guess just being mindful of that it does have that effect. And if you're super nervous or anxious as a racer, it's probably, we need to be systematic around where that happens and where it goes in your plan, because I won't give a nervous racer a whole hit of caffeine before they start. That's not going to help with anxiety. As you get into a swim, like a group pack sort of rolling start swim, in a wetsuit as well, it just kind of heightens that anxiety and pressure. So I generally don't feed anxious, nervous racers caffeine before a race. Good morning, Beck Bergland. So a couple of things to note about caffeine is that it does have a half-life of sort of 6 to 7 hours. So even though you might have like as an example, have a coffee at 8 o'clock in the morning, it's still in your system later on in the day with it taking 6 to 7 hours to break down half of it. So even though you don't feel necessarily the effects anymore, it's still in your system. So timing of caffeine is also really important. We don't want to be having large doses in the afternoon and evening or right before you go to bed, because even though you don't necessarily feel like it affects you, it's still in your system and you're less likely to have a good sleep. And for some people, it's a real struggle to get to sleep. And then the quality of sleep can be quite bad too. So just keep that in mind when we're talking about caffeine or we're looking at using it, is that you make sure you're doing it well away from your sleep. So it's used in the morning, rather than trying to have a massive dose before you go to bed. Probably wouldn't necessarily recommend that. So we know that caffeine peaks in the bloodstream around, 30 to 45 minutes after taking it, up to sort of 60 minutes. So everyone's a little bit different with that. So sort of 45 minutes is a good general guide, but you'll know generally, you'll sort of feel that big caffeine peak after you've had a coffee or you take something that's got caffeine in it, you'll feel that peak sort of 45 minutes afterwards. So that's really useful to know in terms of timing of taking it as well. So you want to make sure that your caffeine is timed for when you need it. So again, say a nervous racer, I'm not going to give them caffeine an hour before race start because that's going to be peaking right as the start gun goes off, which is not going to be particularly useful. Good morning, Catfish Designs. So there's a series of responses, a variable response for caffeine, and there's definitely positives and negatives. And I would say that I've also seen responders and non-responders too. So it's really important to trial caffeine use in training before you think about doing it in a race. Like I would never try caffeine for the first time in a race, unless it was a particularly not important race whatsoever, but definitely try it in training first, just to make sure you don't get like the nervous anxiety sweats or need to run to the toilet or anything like that. Like all those things are not going to end well. So how much caffeine do you need? Now, the research in this space has evolved more over the last sort of 15, 20 years. So before we thought you needed a fair whack of caffeine, but now we know that the smallest amount possible to elicit the best response is what you need. And it's, yeah, not that amount, not that much. So it's an amount per kilo of body weight, and work with the sports dietitian to understand what your specific needs are. But as an example, I had an athlete, he'd be 90 kilos and he was having 100 milligrams of caffeine plus, like I think more like 150 every hour. So that's 150 divided by 90, featuring my calculator from school. So yeah, really high doses, like crazy doses, and every hour. So your caffeine needs to be like a certain amount for your event, really, depending on how long it is. You might need that amount a couple of times if you're doing an Ironman, but he's having his amount like for his event every single hour. So one of the strategies I did with him was like pull that right back, because he was getting gut issues and he's a nervous racer, and just wasn't working for him, and he was starting to feel pretty rough on the back of the bike. So that doesn't bode well for an Ironman when you've still got to run a marathon off the back of the bike. So sometimes, yeah, more is not better with caffeine. The performance enhancement of caffeine definitely plateaus at a certain amount. So like you want to have that small dose in the beginning, and find the smallest dose possible that gets your peak nice, and then it's going to plateau. So more doesn't equal better performance. It plateaus. It's only going to heighten the negative effects of caffeine if you throw more in the system. So a couple of the negative effects to just talk about are increased heart rate, which is not good if you're doing endurance events, particularly an Ironman. And then another one is actually impaired fine motor skills. So you'd think it would do a better job of fine motor skill management, and it does to a certain degree, but more caffeine actually impairs that. And then I guess the obvious one is anxiety over arousal, and just getting stressed and nervous. And we don't want that. And then I guess a lot of people will resonate with this one, but going to the toilet afterwards as well. And that's quite common because caffeine actually stimulates the digestive tract. It increases the peristalsis movement of your gut muscles. And so whatever's in there, it just rushes it out. And that's okay, particularly if that's happening before you do a race. But you don't want that happening in a race either. So just being mindful of your timing of caffeine. So when do you take caffeine? I would take it depending on who you are and what your event is, potentially before. And if you're doing something super long, that you might want to take it before and during as well. So again, something to kind of practice your protocol in training. Work with a sports dietitian to figure out what your protocol is and then practice it first. And remembering that more is not better. We want to have the lowest dose possible and the highest effect. So if you're a current caffeine user, like I would definitely recommend people use caffeine, as long as the foundations of everything else are good first. Remember, we talk about supplements as the sprinkles on the icing on the cake. or the top of the pyramid. So making sure that you've got this foundational layer of your race nutrition or day-to-day nutrition sorted first. Good morning, Alex. Then we're working on the sports nutrition principles. So in terms of like an Ironman race, we've got carb loading going on. We've got hydration. We've got maybe for a hot race like Cairns last week, we talked about sodium loading. So you've got that stuff sorted first, and then we're loading some caffeine on top of that as well. Good morning, Elsa Nutritionist. I can't believe you're here. Alex, hello, welcome. Okay, so they would be the times that I would use it. So it depends on how long your event is, or your training session is, and practicing that in training. So getting a protocol that works for you. Now, I would start with the lowest dose possible and slowly build up until you find your threshold. So yeah, a lot of practice in training will be useful for that. The other, if you've got any questions, type them in. I haven't seen any come through on Facebook necessarily, but that's okay. I'm going to see if this actually works. It may not, Facebook may not be working, but at least there's some cool peeps on Insta. One of the common misconceptions that I find or hear about with caffeine is that you need to stop taking it before and kind of withdraw to then have a better effect when you do your event. And that's not true. So there's quite a few papers on this now where the caffeine users and the non-caffeine users, there was no real increase in performance when they were given caffeine in the trial. So even people that withdrew, they had their caffeine withdrawal heading into an event and then were given caffeine, like their performance was no better. So don't give yourself headaches or suffer through caffeine withdrawals if you think that that's going to help with your event. It doesn't. You're better off just having your habitual caffeine intake. Cheers. And then having caffeine in your event as well. So I find that I get that question a fair bit. And I guess the last point is that caffeine is not a substitute for quality training. Okay, you still have to do the hard yards in training, build your experience, and then, like I said, caffeine is the sprinkles on the icing on the cake. Okay, so you've got to get all that foundational stuff right first. You can't not train and then go and do an event and think caffeine's going to save you. It's not going to save you. You need to put in the hard yards with training. All right, Alex said, I know, crazy, right? It isn't without a lot of noise in the background. That's okay. I can't hear your noise, Alex, so it's fine. Beyond Ultra said, if you want to feel the effects of caffeine, train with it, makes sense. Yeah, totally. And I think, you know, if you're listening earlier on as well, Beyond Ultras, it's about trying to find your protocol that works for you too. So a little bit of trial and error in training is really useful so that you're comfortable and confident in your plan come race day too. Emma said, best news ever, morning coffees are safe. Yes, they're safe. And I'll often, you know, write coffee into meal plans. I'm not going to take coffee away from you. Coffee is life. But I guess just for general health and well-being, there's some good benefits to having caffeine or coffee and the antioxidant effects and other effects of coffee. But more, like I said earlier, more is not better. So, you know, four coffees a day is your maximum amount. And I guess it depends on what they are. So if you're having 2 double shots, I would say that's 4 coffees, and that would be max. So I sometimes take coffee away from people. I know it's mean, but just try and pair them back to sort of max 2 a day. Because remember that the caffeine content of coffees varies really widely. So if you might be able to get away with 4 really weak coffees, but if you're having really strong ones, then your limit is potentially like, you know, 2 or maybe even 1. I think my limit's 1 with these coffees that we make at home. They are pretty good. I call them productivity juice because I think they're quite strong. And if I go and have a coffee out now, I don't feel the same effects of the coffee at home. So that's really bad, isn't it? All right, I can't see any questions come through. Please ask away if you've got any. I'm not sure much is happening on the Facebook, so let me know if you're here. Again, testing a different method with Facebook Live, so we'll see if it works or not. Elsa Nutritionist said, geisha coffee from Panama is one of the best. I'm sure it is. So you must be in Panama, Elsa. Welcome if you are. All right. So yeah, ask away if you've got any questions. That was kind of all I wanted to say about caffeine. Just to run you through a bit about like where it comes from and what it is and how to use it. Definitely, if you are using caffeine in your events, have a look at how much is in the products that you're using. So the athlete example that I gave you before, I think it was in his sports drink, which I'm not a huge fan of because it's hard to then control. So if he wanted more fuel, he therefore gets more caffeine, and that's not better. Whereas if he is under drinking or under fueling, then he's losing the caffeine. So I kind of like to separate it because you've got better control of what's going on if you do, or really dial down the amount of caffeine in the sports drink and just have a little baseline trickling in, like really low, low, low. And then you can add more on top of that easily as well. So things like no-dos or Revy strips or gels or blocks or something that have caffeine in them. So I prefer to have more control than just loading it into a sports drink and, you know, that's it. Elsa said she's in Panama. Welcome. What time is it in Panama, Elsa? All right, so it doesn't look like there's any questions that have come through. There's a couple of people on Facebook. Please give me a holler if you're here. Tracy said, is it better to take 200 milligrams at the start of a race or 100 milligrams at the start and 100 milligrams halfway through? I take no-dos. I race for 5 hours in mountain bike races. Good work, Tracy. Good question. So it depends how heavy you are, Tracy, for sure, to give you specifics on that. And I would, as an example, if you're riding for 5 hours, I would take half before and half during. So remembering that caffeine takes about 45 minutes to peak in your bloodstream. So if you're a nervous racer, I would not have it right like 45 minutes before the start. I'd potentially have it just before the start, so it's not peaking as you're starting, or peaking before you're starting. That's work. And then having some halfway through. So depending on how much you weigh, Tracy, 200 milligrams might be actually too much for you. So you could play around with scaling that back, and then seeing if you can even drip feed it a bit more than that. What is a recommended amount per kilo of body weight? Obviously it can be individual, but what does the research say? Good question. So the old research was around 6 milligrams per kilo, and that is way too much. So it's halved now, and you can get benefits from just 1 milligram per kilo. So if you weigh 60 kilos, that's 60 milligrams, which is why I'm asking what you weigh, Tracy. Becca says hi, and Tracy said 60 kilo. There you go. So if she's 60 kilos, then you could start with 60 milligrams and see if that has the same effect as what you're doing with 200. Good morning, Runny Mums. Megan said, in a race situation, once you start taking caffeine, should you continue taking caffeine in gels, for example? Good question. Yes, I love this. So I've heard from a lot of people that they delay drinking Coke as an example because they think that once they start, that's it, like you can't get off it from then. So and I think that's incorrect. Again, like half-life of caffeine is 6 to 7 hours, so it's going to be in your system no matter what. And then the peak is around sort of 45 minutes in. So if you've taken some before, then you kind of drip feed it throughout your event. It doesn't mean that you have to delay starting. Remember, it's going to lower our perceived rate of exertion, right? So we want that really. Like you can start to get on caffeine once you feel fatigued, if that feels good for you. But I just think, like, why not do it from the beginning so that you're feeling great throughout? Alex said, I'm weird and don't actually drink coffee. Love my tea though. Even after a night shift, caffeine fuel, I can jump straight into bed and sleep. That's probably because you're just so absolutely wrecked, Alex. But you will not sleep as well if you use caffeine before bed. So you might be able to fall asleep easily, but if you track your sleep with anything, then you'll see that your sleep quality is not as good as if you don't use caffeine. And right in the beginning, we talked about how much caffeine's in tea, and it varies. So it could be anywhere from like 9 milligrams up to 50 milligrams for how long you steep it in the hot water for, where it's from, and all that sort of stuff. Bex jumped from Facebook to Instagram. Welcome, Beck. And Alex said, I must live under a rock. I've never thought about no-dos. I've only ever had caffeine in gels towards the end of a race. You don't live under a rock, Alex. You're just not an endurance sports dietitian. This is what I live and breathe. So no-dose is a kind of easy form in that it's just a little tablet that you can take, but it is 100 milligrams straight up. So that might be beyond your dosing. You can take a half a tablet, but then we get down to the practicalities of like, how do you carry it and how do you take it when you're on a TT bike in an Ironman? So all of these things that we're talking about, it really is like individual, and it depends on you and what your situation is, because you know what might work for one person is not necessarily going to work for another or your training buddy. So just keeping that in mind, that anything that you do really needs to be what works for you. So Tracy said, my question was more about taking it in one lump or separating it. So it depends, Tracy. It depends like what sort of racer you are and what like sort of effects you get from it. So I would, for you, like without knowing anything about you, I'd suggest maybe taking a small amount before, so maybe half a no-dose, and then just taking little bits right throughout your race. So you kind of drip feed it in. So remembering that caffeine peaks at around 45 minutes. It's in your system for 6 to 7 hours. So it doesn't stay at that peak for 6 to 7 hours. It does decline, you know, the half-life does decline. So if you're sort of drip feeding little bits in, you can keep your level sort of similar in your bloodstream, if that makes sense. So I would play around with both options and see what feels better like to answer your question. Alex said, I think with 2 little ones asleep is as good as it can get at the moment. Yeah, exactly. You probably just need caffeine to function, Alex. And if you're not a coffee drinker, tea is just as good. Maybe you want to put a double tea bag in to increase your dose per cup if you've got less time to drink it. All right, Tracy, does that answer your question? In terms of what you do? So yeah, highly individual. Without knowing anything about you, I would put a small amount in to start with, so maybe half a no-dose, and then drip feed the rest rather than taking another massive dose later. Tracy said thanks. Cool. All right, any other questions? We are a bit over time today, but it's been good and fun. I think I'm definitely going to jump back on the Instagram lives. I haven't done those for a little while, but it looks like most people are on their live, so we're going to do that. If you weren't here at the beginning, please, well, go back and watch the replay if you want to learn more about caffeine from what we talked about at the start. But one of the announcements I made at the start was that if you're a triathlete and you need some help with nutrition, or you want to join our community, then please jump onto the website and join the waitlist for the Triathlon Nutrition Academy. It is coming in September. There's a firm date set. It's happening. So go to dietitianapproved.com.au/Triathlon Nutrition Academy. Click on the button and join the wait list. I'm not going to spam you, but closer to the time, you'll get some information about when it starts and what's going on, plus also a bunch of freebies as we kind of launch that as well. So please join me if that's of interest to you. All right. Beyond Ultras said cheers and all the best. Thank you. Thanks for joining me. Alex said, thanks, we'll try and get on earlier next week. You're welcome. And Beck said, coffee is life. So on that note, I might sign out, finish my coffee, and see you next week. See you later.